Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last panel of the day. You guys have great stamina to remain here, but the advantage of this is you may avoid some of the traffic in Atlanta, which has now become a terribly international kind of traffic congestion. This panel, as you know by your program, focuses on two of the other gorillas in the international system. Some people will say the United States is the 500-pound gorilla. People fail to realize that the European Union is clearly a close second in that field, and we have unfortunately not recognized the power of that partnership in recent years. But there are, as you know, two other gorillas out there that we have to be concerned with. If this panel had been taking place at the end of the Cold War, we would have been talking in terms of dealing with China and Russia in terms of managing and encouraging the emergence of China into the international cooperative system as an important power. We also were talking at that time about how we extended that marvelous footprint of cooperation that had developed between the United States and Europe in the transatlantic relationship, extending that footprint further eastward, not just into Eastern Europe, but into Russia itself and beyond. I'm afraid that that optimism that we had at that particular point in history has not borne the kind of fruit that we had hoped it might. That isn't to say that all is lost. It is simply to say that the challenges that we confront today are certainly greater in some ways than the challenges we confronted then. We now see a China that has created some issues with its nine dotted line in the South China and East China Sea. We see a China that is looking outward much more than it ever has in the past. Some are concerned about Djibouti and the basin of Djibouti. I see it as others as not a particularly big problem. Nevertheless, we see things like live fire exercises in the Taiwan Straits, and we see a general concern that's now being expressed by a growing, perhaps, authoritarianism that is emerging with Xi as a potential long-term Mao kind of leader. Not necessarily following the same policies, but nevertheless. We also see a Russia that has troubled us with its actions in the Crimea, its overflight and incursions on some of the European countries' territory. We see the problems in Donbass continuing, and we see Russian actions with regard to the emplacement of nuclear-capable missiles in Kaliningrad and problems in Syria. So these are serious issues that we need to confront. There are many ways of confronting these issues. Our great partners in Europe have opportunities that perhaps we are foreclosing on. So today we will look at the EU's relationship with China and Russia. And with us today we have four very, very distinguished people. I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. Celeste Wallander, President and CEO of the U.S.-Russia Foundation, has served as a special assistant to the President and Senior Director of Russia and Eurasia on the National Security Council, and also as what we call DASD, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense.
Job.
In 2009 to 2012. Second on the list today will be Adam Stuhlberg, our own very Adam Stuhlberg, Professor and Neal Family Chair and Associate Chair Research and Co-Director of the Center for International Strategy, Technology and Policy here at Georgia Tech, whose specialty is in international security and Russian Eurasian politics and security affairs. Speaking third today will be Theresa Fallon. She's, as you note by all of the information you've been received, a Brussels-based an analyst, writer, and commentator on global energy and global politics for over the past 20 years and founder of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. And finally, but certainly not least, Scott Brown, doing a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Europeans and Transatlantic Studies with the Sam Nunn School. And he has his PhD from the University of Glasgow, and his research focus is on the EU, US, and China relations. So without further ado, let me turn the microphone over to Celeste for her commentary.
Thank you very much, and thank you again to the organizers and sponsors for including me in this discussion. It's really wonderful to meet us. I've met so many students, met so many faculty who are here working on Europe, and I've really learned a lot already today. And I'm really grateful to my previous co-panelists, because a number of the themes that they introduced and defended earlier this afternoon are things I'm going to pick up on. So what I want to do is lay out what I think Russian national interests are and what the implications of those interests are. And they actually link up very well with the point about where we were at the end of the Cold War in our Russia policy. So the first observation I would make is that although I have a reputation as an institutionalist in international relations theory, I actually consider myself quite a realist. And I think that where you start to understand a country's foreign policy is to understand the national interests of that country. But what I would argue is that the definition of the national interest differs in countries that are differently organized. National interests in a democracy tend to reflect the interests of the broad swath of that society, exactly because governments are accountable to all the different interest groups, business, civil society, faith groups, everything across society. So the policy reflects the country. But in authoritarian regimes, national interests reflect regime interests. The people who are in control, who are in power, are not accountable to their citizens. There may be interest groups. Military-driven authoritarian regimes are different than a Communist Party-driven authoritarian regime like we have in China. And they're also different than what you have in Russia, because Russia is an authoritarian regime, but it is of a particular peculiar type, and I think Evelyn referred to it earlier. It's what we now call Putinism. What is Putinism? Putinism is a political economic system in which being powerful requires access to and control over rents, like sort of excess profits in the economic system, the sloshing around of money. And access and control of the rent and control of the rents depends on political power. So the core of Putinism is corruption, and the core of Putinism is use of political power to access and control, not the money so much itself, but the distribution of money to those within your clan, within your little support group, in order to sustain you in power, in order so that you can continue to access those rents, and it's a cycle, it's a loop. And the clans that matter in contemporary Russia are not the oligarchs. They are the sets of clan-based relationships that Putin brought with him from St. Petersburg, which are in some cases rooted in the security services, but they're much more rooted in the corrupt economic and business practices that were developed in St. Petersburg, and which was so brilliantly documented by my dear friend and mentor, Karen DeWisho, who just passed away this week in her book on Russian kleptocracy. So I won't go into great detail on that because I don't want to go over my time, but that's what you need to understand. So when you hear people talk about the Russian national interest, I think that's a useful concept, but understand that the national interest is the interest of the regime. And that's not only true of Russia. That tends to be true of all authoritarian regimes. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the international system? Well, just to cut to the chase, the strategy of the United States and Europe at the end of the Cold War was predicated on the understanding, and I think it was the right understanding, that the Russian elite sought integration in the international system, sought to become a constructive stakeholder, because the bet was that Russia sought to be modern, secure, prosperous, globalized in the international system. That was the elite. That was the Yeltsin elite. They were also corrupt, but it's a different kind of political corruption in the Yeltsin elite. And what we have under Putinism is actually now a political system that is inconsistent with integration and globalization. Because a corrupt political economic system like Putinism depends on non-transparency. It depends on not having to live up to the rules, being selective about which rules you live up to. It depends on problematic investor rights and shareholder rights. It depends on being able to have kind of murky sales of private companies that all of a sudden it turns out the Russian state owns a controlling stake in, or people from the circles around Putin, such as Igor Sechin or Gennady Timchenko or the Rottenberg brothers, mysteriously end up owning all the best stuff. Wow. And their children, by the way. And that relates to sanctions. We could talk, because I know Anne's planning and talking about, sanctions. So when Putin came back to power in 2012 and saw the protest, the Bolotnaya protest, the famous protest that he then blamed Hillary Clinton for, he was shocked to find that actually some elements of the Russian citizenship actually believed that integration process, which includes democratization, liberal values, and accountability of governments, is what the path Russia was on. And what you've seen since 2012 is within Russia a dismantling of those accountability mechanisms, those transparency mechanisms, the passing of the Foreign Agents Law, a whole set of moves inside of Russia, and the identification of that global system and the rules and institutions of the global liberal order as being a threat to how Russia is ruled inside. And I have to say that they're not entirely wrong, not in the claim that you will hear from Russian leaders that the United States is the number one problem in the Russian mind, in the leadership's mind on this, in using the rules of responsibility to protect, for example, UN rule of agreed upon rule and responsibility to protect, or WTO rules, or arms control implementation, all these rules that the Russian leadership under Putin has convinced itself that those are rules that the United States seeks to use to weaken, encircle, and coerce Putin's Russia, with an eye towards what in the Russian mindset is a pattern of US behavior that started with Serbia and Kosovo, extended to Georgia with the Rose Revolution, the US intervention in Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein, the US repeated interventions in Ukraine to cause an Orange Revolution, and of course Libya. So the point is, those were all, in the Russian mindset, those were all laying the ground, the international legal ground, and also the power base for eventually the real prize in the Kremlin's mind, which is to constrain and ultimately overthrow the Putin leadership. So why do I say all this? Because for me, thinking about what is the relationship between the EU and Russia, Russia is still an important trading partner with the EU, and even though trade fell after not just because of Crimea and Ukraine, but because the Russian economy was crashing already after 2013. But the EU is Russia's largest trading partner. Russia is the EU's fourth largest trading partner. The EU is still the source of, to the extent there is foreign investment in Russia, it is the single largest source, although 30% of that comes from Cyprus, which means it's not really coming from Europe, it's coming from Russian money planted in Cyprus, but still, it's coming from Europe. So those economic relations are important. But Europe faces the same challenge that the United States faces, which is the Kremlin seeks to either not play by the rules of the international game or selectively play by those rules that are to its advantage, like exercising a UN Security Council resolution veto in order to protect favorite clients like Assad in Syria, but is either breaking rules that it doesn't want to follow, including arms control treaties. Arms control is important. New START treaty is about the only arms control treaty that the Russians are actually implementing at this point. They're not implementing CFE treaty, that threatens Europe. They're violating the Open Skies Treaty, that's not as talked about it publicly, but they're not living up to their obligations under the arms control treaty, the Open Skies Treaty. And then there's the INF treaty violation. And those missiles, those INF range missiles, they're intermediate range missiles. They can't hit the United States. Those are missiles that can hit European territory and China, but that's a different issue. We could have a panel on Russia-China relations. That would be a separate conversation. So the challenge for the EU is, I'm going to be a little bit mean to Sven. I don't know if he's here still. But the challenge for the EU isn't to figure out how to cooperate with Russia. The challenge for the EU is the same as the US challenge, which is how do you defend your interests with a Russia that rejects the system that protects your interests? That doesn't mean you don't cooperate with Russia, but cooperation is an instrument to secure your interests. It shouldn't be the goal. If cooperation is the goal, then you're misdirecting, because right now you can cooperate with this Russia. You can cooperate with this Kremlin, but you have to do it on their terms. And their terms require undermining the very rules of the international order that keep the United States and Europe, even more, I think, secure, stable, prosperous, and capable of sustaining those systems of values. And so that's the big challenge, and that's where you see the friction. You see the friction on Syria, based on Russia's rejection of all kinds of UN Security Council agreements on limiting Syria's chemical weapons capability, for example. I'm exaggerating a bit, and I'm just give a couple more examples and turn it over to Alan. But the Obama White House wasn't so focused on the Russian intervention in Ukraine because we love Ukrainians, although I do love Ukrainians. It is because it wasn't altruistic. It was actually self-interested. The Russians were violating core commitments of the UN Charter in changing borders through the use of force. And that's really what motivated Europe, too, because that was a stark threat to what keeps Europe safe, too. I mean, even more than the United States. And so the challenge going forward for the EU is figuring out how to sustain the beneficial economic relations. And I very much believe that we should sustain those relations, because closing off Russia will just feed, remember, that's what the Kremlin wants. Closing off Russia from the outside world actually feeds Putinism. That's what, will help protect it, they think. So keeping the door open to Russia, keeping the door open to private business, to scientists and professors, to society in Russia is really important. But we've got to do that at the same time as we defend those rules of the liberal order that are so problematic right now in the relationship with Russia. And I think Europe's done it, the EU, I'll close with this. I think the EU's actually done a really good job of this. And it's easy for Americans to, bash the EU for this and that. But the EU actually has been a voice because it is value-based. And because, the expectations about being able to work with Russia were so high and the disappointment was so great. But I do think we're entering a much more complicated period in sustaining that focus because you're lacking US leadership on this and a good partner for a while. So we need you to sustain that commitment to the liberal rules-based order so that when we come back and we're ready to lead on that too, there'll be something left to work on.
Nope. It's not up. I have the both unenviable and enviable position of following Celeste. It's enviable because she has covered the landscape and allowed me to drill down a little bit narrowly. It's unenviable because it's very hard to really match what she says. But in general, I agree with her on the big picture. And what I want to do is talk more specifically about a dimension of the triangular relationship that's getting a lot of attention these days. This is the wrong one. It's got it different.
I know, I'm just going to make it. Sorry.
Which is the sanctions issues here. Oh, here we go. You got it.
Yeah?
Yep. But now we can't see it on that. Yeah, you got it on the screen.
Yeah, it's not coming up here, though. That's great. Yeah, start again.
Yeah, that's why we're at Georgia Tech.
That's why I don't do slides.
I'll give it a couple. Oh, all right, looks like we're there now. Okay. So what I want to do is focus on a specific part of the relationship, which has to do with sanctions, and talk about what is seen from the outside really as sanctions mania on all sides. And from that outside, it seems like sanctions are just part of a tit-for-tat game. There's little at stake, and there's a lot of noise, and little effect. And I want to argue in the few minutes that we have is that I do think that sanctions are starting to get serious because energy is now focusing front and center across all dimensions, from individuals to firms to sectors in these sanctions. But those effects are not as direct as most people talk about in terms of changing specific behavior of Russia's actions in Crimea or the Minsk process or in Syria, as much as having an indirect effect on narrowing that bargaining space and creating some dilemmas that are really trilateral. And all three parties, the EU, US, and Russia, will find themselves hemmed in when they get out of this funk of having their foreign policies towards each other consumed by domestic politics. So let me talk a little bit about let me deconstruct a little bit of this. So as I mentioned, we see right now that both sanctions and energy as part of sanctions and broader elements of statecraft are really at focal points for all three parties. And of course, really since June of last year, we've seen energy sanctions really appear front and center in the U.S. And there's a question about what does that actually mean? And as I mentioned, I think that's going to present a bigger strategic challenge as well as an opportunity, I would say, down the road. But when we look immediately at sanctions, I would argue that looking for the direct effect, it's very difficult to find. I think that, one, it's not clear what the sanctions are aiming to do, notwithstanding the letters of their intentions. There are unclear metrics. If I were in Putin's shoes, it's very difficult to know what I could do that would relax sanctions other than giving up everything that seemingly matters to them. They're open-ended. There's a disconnect with the system that I think Celeste aptly captured. It's not so much about oligarchs. It's about specific types of folks that are involved in this Putinist system. And if you look at the most recent sanctions, it's a little incoherent. There's some folks that seem to make sense that are on the list, some folks that don't seem to make sense that are on the list, and some folks that are not on the list that would make sense to put them on there. So it seems out of touch with at least the way the system is set up now. But if you listen to what they're talking about in terms of a rotation of elites and the types of people that we may see come into that system, they don't seem to register at all on where the targets are right now. So I would argue that they're marred by diffuse objectives that are problematic and not consistent with where that Russian system is. Also, I think, are vulnerable to Russia's compensatory measures. And their ways of either using it for protectionism to bring in their liquidity or to bring in capital, Russian capital. There's been some fiscal discipline, of course, with oil prices fluctuating. That's also allowed them to dampen some of the effects. And now we see, especially on the energy front, right? If you look at gas exports to Europe, or even Russian oil production, the sanctions don't seem to have an immediate effect. Europe is actually buying more gas since the sanctions have been imposed, and Russia is producing more oil, likely through mid-2020s. So it's not clear that there's having much of effect there in the short term. But there's also collateral damage, I would argue, about the sanctions. It's very difficult to measure what's been affected, and the State Department produced a paper, and several others have tried to look at those effects. But most of the analyses have not looked at the reciprocal effects. And if we're looking, sometimes we look at specific companies in Russia, but we don't look at the reciprocal effects on specific companies in Europe. It's usually at a broader GDP level. But there are some reciprocal effects. But there are also, I think these sanctions over time are also exposing differences in approaches between the U.S. and the EU, especially on energy-related issues. And we can maybe talk more about that. You know, for sanctions to be effective, they not only have to be credible as you issuing threats, you have to have the be able to deliver on what the targets of the sanctions are, but you also have to be able to reassure the target that you can relax them when they do change the behavior. And one of the problems I would argue with the sanctions on Russia is that even if they are having some effect, they may be causing a de-risking problem that may make it harder to reassure Russia down the road when relations change. And so that's something to look out for. And there's some argument about whether or not sanctions are causing a rally around the flag effect in Russia. I don't know if that's so much the case, because I think you saw support bolstered by the Crimean incursion or annexation prior to the imposition of sanctions, but they've certainly taken on a more of an anti-Western dimension of public support. But that said, and irrespective of whether or not the sanctions are having a tangible effect, they're here. And I would argue they're here to stay, longer potentially than we may want them, and for various reasons. And to save time, I would argue that we're finding ourselves down the road in a very difficult strategic situation. Right now, I think for all the reasons everybody mentioned, it's a folly to think that we're going to be able to have constructive engagement. For the most part, I think, as I mentioned, I see our relations on all sides really being consumed by our respective domestic politics, and as a result, we're seeing the sort of sanctions outbidding because that's the only tool we seem to be able to have. But I think the result of this is that it's creating a set of overlapping strategic dilemmas. And for the United States and this particular administration, they have to be able to sustain the sanctions with circumscribed authority. Now the Congress has some veto power over some of the presidential discretion over some of those sanctions. And they have to do that while reassuring the Kremlin that when the parties are ready to come to the table, that they'll be able to actually to deliver. Similarly, on the Russia side, they have to worry about inadvertent and uncontrolled escalation. They have to preserve their stature in established markets, like especially in the energy space in Europe. They have to contain their liquidity problems that they're bound to face, but at the same time, they are going to need to somehow save face on these issues when the time comes. And the EU, of course, needs to maintain a united front and leverage their market or soft power or institutional power, while, because of the issues that Celeste mentioned, given the deep economic relations, they need to proffer some carrots to engage some diverse Russian stakeholders down the road. And so I would argue the impact of these three sort of interlocking dilemmas is that it really narrows the bargaining space once the parties are ready to negotiate. So I think this is one of the longer-term impacts of sanctions. It's going to be very difficult to get out of this mess and to signal, which is so important for these relationships. You know, we're finding ourselves in a period, because of the nature of our relations, we have to make very conspicuous signals and loud signals. But our political situation and particularly in the United States, the institutional constraints on the executive, I don't think are going to allow that. So we need to be able to find some way to signal tangibly. And here's where I would just argue, and we can talk maybe more about this later, about energy. And somebody mentioned that the energy landscape is not what it was in 2009 or even really in 2013. It's much more integrated in a network context. And its networks are operating at multiple levels, physically, as is highlighted here, but also in terms of corporate relationships. And it's a much more integrated context. And it's not just integrated because there are different hubs of influence and of resilience within that European landscape. And as a result, I would argue that Europe today is much more resilient. And there are some weak areas, but it's less about bringing in, gas from a certain pipeline than building up the resilience of some of the hubs within Europe. These networks really involve Russia, whether or not we like it or not. So Russia may be not wield the market power that it always had, but it certainly is important in these networks. I think Ukraine too has a valuable role to play, but it's in terms of being part of those integrated networks, not being treated as an aberration. And so what does all of this mean?
Well, I think ultimately, notwithstanding all the rancor today and where energy is focusing is a focal point of a lot of acrimony, I think down the road energy can actually be not only a productive, tangible signal because of the resilience, but it can be an opportunity to rebuild cooperation, and not on Russia's terms because of the resilience that's actually built into it. And because there are a number of trusted Russian stakeholders for Europeans to engage. And so I would argue that the priority should not be on targeting specific pipeline deals like Nord Stream, but focusing on the coherence, the efficacy, and really the resilience of that whole network. Because that will create not only security interests within and bolster security and energy security within Europe, but it will also create potentially an opportunity for engaging Russia on our terms or on European and integrated market terms rather than on that Putin regime's terms that Celeste mentioned. So I can fill in some of the gaps in some of the Q&A, but I want to give my colleagues some more time.
I'll bring this because I always get thirsty. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's my first time in Atlanta, and I'm just thrilled to be here. I have both European and U.S. citizenship, so I feel very honored to be speaking at this event. And I was based in Beijing from 2003 to 2007 and Moscow 1998 to 2003. So it's really a wonderful panel to be on, and I'm so honored to be with all these extremely talented panelists. So I was asked to talk about how China sees Europe, how Europe sees China, and vice versa. So just briefly, Chinese perspective, the European perspective, and future prospects. A lot of these things were touched on briefly, so I'm going to try to weave some of these issues together. So how does China see Europe? All right, so it's China's age of ambition meets Europe's age of exhaustion. The Chinese really see Europe as kind of worn out, tired, and not actually leading any longer. So the Chinese have said to them in meetings like, we will help you with global governance. We will, it's our turn to lead. So the Europeans, in their eyes, are kind of, it's a reflection of Chinese ambition and almost, their pride in all their accomplishments. It's also an important source of technology, as we've seen with the recent Extron. Well, that deal was ended Pakuka. Actually, I have to stand here. It's easier if I see. No, it's not going to work. Okay, I'm not used to doing it this way. So it's also a very important source of technology. And global governance issues. China's narrative with Europe is that we will lead together. And this is from a conference I attended in Shanghai with former President Prodi. So he's very supportive of this narrative. And earlier, and it's been a thread through the entire day about values. And China really sees this as something that's a problem for them because they don't believe in universal values. Universal values are, according to Fu Ying at the Munich Security Conference, they're not really universal, they're just American. And she said to the audience, I see all of you nodding your head in agreement, which I found very shocking. But this is a very key point for China. So no one wants to look at values in regard to the relationship, but for the Chinese, they really do see it as a threat in any form of a relationship. So how Europeans see China. So there's Canada and the US are at the top, but I put that in there so you could see the difference, and this is from Pew Research 2017. And I only have a few minutes, so you can just glance at that graph quickly. And China is increasingly being perceived in the EU Council. So as concerns grow towards China, we've seen the honeymoon period early on, say 2003, and the relationship has evolved. So now this is a picture of the council and the dragon. I hate when people talk about the dragon or the elephant for China or the bear for Russia, but this is from a political cartoon. And then, of course, everybody wants to make money. Everyone sees China as the ultimate market. And people have been saying that, as Jim Chanos recently commented, since 1898. Everyone expects to make money in China, and very few actually do. And if they do it, they try to keep it quiet. So there's some perceptions there. And then most say China does not respect personal freedom. So we have a gap in this idea of values. But no one's really touched on the one topic I think that's very important, and is the erosion of values. I mean, we've seen China rise as a power, but we've seen also a complete erosion of values. For example, Cambridge University Press, their acronym is CUP, recently said that they were asked by the Chinese to self-censor articles in this publication. It's one of the most prestigious journals in the world, and they agreed. So when these very leading academic journals agree to self-censor, then we have to question, is it China or is it the West willing to, erode their values? So they did change. Cambridge University Press reversed their decision based on all these academics saying that they would refuse to, submit articles to them any longer. But then I can give you another recent example. Springer, a German publisher, refuses to, they want to get into the Chinese market, so they've agreed to self-censor. And they do many, many publications. So the other thing that Europe fears is the G2, that they'll be locked out. They'll be the US and China, and that Europe is kind of sidelined. So this is a perception that Europeans have as well. And the EU is about values, and here's a nice quote from Juncker. So this is something very important to them, but the reality is, in a lot of actions by businesses, it's not really happening. All right, so now I'll move on to the PRC's grand narrative of Belton Road initiative. It's almost like Rosa Brooks. She wrote that wonderful book about how war became, I took out the slide, how war became everything and everything became war. Well, it's kind of the same thing for the Belton Road initiative. Everything revolves around the Belton Road. So if there's an issue about market economy status, the Chinese have another conference on Belton Road. If they're worried about certain issues, they just use it as a platform to address many, many issues. So it's kind of this one-size-fits-all approach to EU-China relations. So I'll just do a quick overview of the Belton Road. Here's the official banner. They're not trying to hide anything. It's red. You see that symbol right in the front. It's, they're not really, it has an interesting approach. It has an official song, a dance. Can you tell me what they're holding in their hands? It's an abacus. This is from a performance that took place in Belgium. It's kind of a hybrid Chinese show meets Broadway, and this is the Abacus Dance. Everyone was shaking their abacus because you're all going to make money on the Belton Road. So all roads lead to Europe. So of course they have to get through Eurasia first, but and there are different areas along. There are several corridors, but Europe is one of the important corridors for Chinese trade. So it's deliberately ambiguous. It can be, and this is a quote from Jing Men from the College of Europe at a hearing at the European Parliament. China's BRI is ambiguous and ambitious in A2. So the Europeans like rules. They like everything clear, and so they looked at it with suspicion right from the very beginning. And the Chinese were almost like, why aren't you embracing our great policy? And at the very beginning, they even had a conference. Did you hear what Xi Jinping said? I mean, it wasn't the cleverest title, but they were kind of like, why isn't Europe kind of picking up the ball on this? And the Europeans were very slow and reluctant. So One Belt, One Road, One Belt, One Way. We see a lot of, most trade in the world is done by sea, so 90% of trade goes by sea. So we're trying to understand why is China pushing the rails. One Belt, One Way means that a lot of these rail cars get returned to China empty by ship. So they come by train, so they're heavily subsidized by the Chinese, and then they return by ship. So it doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense. So we're trying to figure out what's the signaling on this, what's the political ramifications. And lastly is OBOT, One Belt, One Trap. So we've seen this happen in several countries along the way. So Hambantota, for example, the port in Sri Lanka, they had so much debt in China that it's kind of debt for equity. So they were asked to sign over the port for 99 years. So it's kind of a repeat of what the British did to Hong Kong. And so as a late mover, China's able to get ports in strategic areas through this debt trap diplomacy. So Silk Road, a European perspective. I'm going to go over this very quickly because it's a very short presentation. So financial cooperation integration, renminbi internationalization. I know people might be surprised by that, but many Europeans are interested in that. They see that the dollar has too much power. Institutional cooperation, as someone mentioned earlier about the AIIB, the Europeans, even though the US had lobbied them not to join, had joined and didn't even get a heads up. The British didn't even tell them, by the way, we're going to join, and fill Eurasian infrastructure financing gaps and support EU connectivity. So there's a lot of need for infrastructure. It's a big wish list. Challenges, the 16 plus 1 problem. The 16 plus 1 is 11 EU member states and 4 possible accession states in the Central and Eastern Europe. So China has carved out like a sub-regional grouping there. And that's not the only sub-regional grouping that they're trying to carve out. But they've done it in Central and Eastern Europe, and then they're trying to do it with the Nordics, and they're trying to do it with the Mediterranean states. So it's an interesting way to have leverage within Europe, and Brussels is extremely skeptical about this. Europe has a lack of geostrategic vision, lack of transparency. They're worried about China changing norms and values, and and as we know, the EU wouldn't sign the document back in Beijing in May 2017 because of environmental issues, as well as lack of transparency and not an equal playing field. And then, all right, so we all know about the Piraeus investment. Well, this predates the Belton Road initiative, but any successful projects get folded into the narrative. So anything that's good is considered a Belton Road project. Anything that fails, nobody talks about. So the other issue is how now China has invested in Piraeus, and there's a bit of hypocrisy here because people tend to forget that Germany, was pushing austerity, and Greece was almost forced to sell out the entire port to China. The IMF was also supporting this sale. So now all of a sudden Europe is like, oh my gosh, we have such big Chinese investment right here. But I mean, they do have a short memory that it was they were encouraged to sell. Now China's trying to build a railway from Piraeus into Central and Eastern Europe, and this is an interesting choice because it goes through Serbia, a possible accession member state, to Hungary. So China can build things in Serbia that it couldn't do in the EU member states. So it's causing all sorts of problems. And because this deal wasn't vetted properly, there wasn't an EU vetting system, that it's been put on ice now. So many have suspected it was a way for China to have another debt trap right in the middle of Central and Eastern Europe. So it would have been an upgrade of a rail line that already exists, and it would cost about 1.5 billion. 85% of it would be financed by a 20-year loan from China. Now this is extremely odd because the EU, which it doesn't do very good publicity, they get so much funding to these, they have given so much funding to Central and Eastern European member states. Nevertheless, why would Orban's government turn to China for this? So this is something they watched with great worry. I haven't done the figures myself. Someone was quoted as saying it would take 1,200 years to pay back. So it's something very worrisome. So as I mentioned earlier, debt trap diplomacy, and now Orban uses this, domestically in Hungary as well. People are angry about this proposed deal. So it's not going anywhere right now, but it's really because of EU officials kind of putting the kibosh on it. All right, so investment. We've seen an enormous increase in Chinese investment. It started from a very low level, and still today, Singapore invests more in Europe than China, but it's growing, as you can see from this dramatic chart. But the blue line is what's worrisome. Everyone was fine with Chinese investment until it became more difficult for European companies to invest in China. Now, there are many blocks to their investments every year. Okay. And here's a map where you can see where Chinese investments are concentrated. And it's not so high in Central and Eastern Europe, but it's interesting for them to invest there because the Central Eastern European states don't ask for reciprocity. They don't ask, let my company do more work in China. So it's a place that promise diplomacy works as well, although there's a growing, promise fatigue in Central and Eastern Europe. And this is where the money matters the most. Okay. I'm going to move on here. What's really shocking is China now controls 10% of ports in Europe, from nothing to 10%. That's very dramatic. Last week I was on my Easter break and I visited the port of Genoa, and the Chinese have commented to me privately, like half joking, that it hasn't been invested in since Christopher Columbus. So they're looking at places that don't have a lot of investment, and there are good opportunities, and then they can link right up to Switzerland because they have a FTA with Switzerland. So they have a big strategy, and no one seems to be paying attention too much to it, because the Chinese are always saying, we don't have a strategy, it's all organic, it just all happens. But if you really look at what they're doing, I mean, there seems to be, surrounding Europe with their investments. I'm running out of time here, so I'll just, the Made in China 2025, in some respects, China does tell what their plans are. We've seen the KUKA sale. If you go online and Google KUKA, it's a wonderful YouTube ad where this robotic arm is playing ping pong, and so the Chinese are like, I must buy that company. But what happened? There are 12 robotic companies in Germany, and KUKA's the top one. And so the Chinese bought it, and it's kind of using the liberal system to buy a company. I mean, you can't argue with them because it was for sale. The Chinese bought it. But within 2 months, Midea, which is a white products manufacturer, so they make washing machines and things like that, bought a high-level robotics company. And because of the civil-military cooperation in China, we know now that German engineers are designing things for the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China. So when Europeans don't pay up their NATO dues, but they're selling military equipment or engineering skills to China, it does create some tensions in the transatlantic relationship. So, inflection point, KUKA, Aixtron, President Obama put the kibosh on that deal. So the Germans were like, thank you, because we don't want to have to say no to China. So Aixtron was a manufacturer in Germany, but they had a small subsidiary in the US, so the US could actually block it. And that's what happens in Europe. Nobody wants to say no to China. So the U.S. won't always be there. Maybe under this administration, they won't be there to say no. So there's talk of a CFIU, similar to the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. Okay. So, and then the EU's evolving approach to FDI, the foreign direct investment. Instead of their future, it's China's future. All right, I won't go here. But I will talk about Serbia very quickly, because we mentioned it on an earlier panel, and I think it's really textbook. You might have seen recent papers about China's United Front activity throughout the world, and they're very active in Europe. But it's interesting what they're doing with Serbia, because Xi Jinping visited there, first Chinese leader in 30 years, and they do all the set things. So they went and opened a cultural center, Confucius Institute. And then, maybe you have forgotten, but in 1999, NATO bombed in Belgrade. In China, every person knows about this. Everyone had the day off from school to protest America, and they all remember this day off, protesting how evil the US was. So there's this interesting relationship between China and Serbia, and if Serbia does become a member of the EU, this will give China so much more leverage within the EU. And if we think things are being blocked now, it will be even more difficult. So there's an added layer of complexity with Chinese investments in this region, and what does it mean? All right, and whoa, what happened here? Okay. And just a reminder about Russia-China maritime exercises in Europe. Europeans tend to think, oh, China's so far away, we don't have to worry about it. But, there's a physical presence that reminds them. Okay, and my time is up, so I'll just finish it here. China does have they've just increased their budget by 15%. They have so much money to throw at all these issues. So we see Xi Jinping's new style. This looks kind of 1960s, but every year they get better and better at their public diplomacy. So, they have Western people, that doesn't work. I tried that for the first time. That's a famous painting of Chairman Mao, but it's with John Hamm's face, but a friend of mine just did it for me, so I don't think that it's working here. Okay, and then, so China's soft diplomacy, there's numerous Confucius Institutes. Britain has the most in all of Europe, outreach to the media, scholarships, think tanks. In Brussels, almost every think tank receives money from China. Talk about values. Can you name a European leader who will meet with the Dalai Lama? I can't think of any. This is, okay. Human rights dialogue is another. UK. Silk Road Squeeze, I don't think I have time, so I'll just, when we talk about values as well, the rule of law, with the arbitral tribunal decision, the US expected Europe to speak with one voice and support it, but at the end of the day, they were only able to acknowledge, which in diplomatic speak is the lowest thing. It's just like you realize it exists. So And it was Hungary came out with a statement afterwards, and this is just not done. If the EU makes a statement, member states agree to that statement, but Hungary released a separate statement. So Hungary is a weak link as well as Greece. This is a list of the countries. Wouldn't it have been much better for China to see the international community respond more strongly if if the EU countries were actually in the first column instead of the second column? And then there's more. There's Hungary refused to sign a letter denouncing torture. First time the EU's statement on human rights was blocked because of investments in Greece. So, to conclude, and now to conclude, the EU always likes to think that there will be reform. And as we've seen with, that's kind of like, we'll work with you, China, we'll help you reform. And now with Xi Jinping actually becoming emperor of everything for life, it kind of removes this fig leaf of future cooperation because it's really clearly an autocracy. So, to conclude, China's economic expansionism is eroding European values. Europe needs to help preserve and strengthen international norms and rules-based system. A multi-speed Belton Road initiative will remain an important aspect of Xi Jinping's foreign policy and diplomacy and may have long-term effect of weakening the EU. Thanks for your attention.
Scott, you're up.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Alistair for asking me to be a part of this conference. A quick couple of things before I hand over with EU-China. Have to correct Bob's introduction. I'm in no way distinguished, especially compared to the other panelists today. So I'm really lucky to be here. I'd also like to, I think I'm the only properly British person. I'm surrounded by Americans, Europeans. Alistair's, of course, British citizen. But I'd really like to say sorry for Brexit. I campaigned against it really hard, and I'm really sorry for everyone and all the consequences of that. So Theresa and I didn't coordinate, but she's covered a lot of the ground that I was going to, so that's great because I can keep this a bit shorter. And one of the issues I'm concerned with in my recent work and just now is the question that's come up a lot today is China's relationship to the liberal international order. And a decade ago, John Eikenberry wrote in an article for Foreign Affairs on the rise of China saying, the liberal international order is really easy to join, but very difficult to overturn. But I think China is giving a good test. It's testing the foundations of the order and seeing where it can, push back the boundaries a little bit. But I'm yet to be persuaded that China's ambition genuinely is to overturn the international system. I think it's just trying to carve out a segment of power for itself within that. Sven went first with self-promotion, so I'm going to jump on that bandwagon too. I had my first book published not too long ago looking at the rise of China in American and European responses. And in that, I wanted to move away from the simplistic dichotomy of treating China as a threat or an opportunity in a way that a lot of the rhetoric goes, and trying to disaggregate threat and opportunity as a spectrum, but across different policy domains as well. And as Alistair alluded to earlier, I've argued that within EU public policy discourse, but also in private discourse, there has been very little consideration of the threat aspects of China. These perceptions are largely absent within the EU, and particularly relative to the United States. And this has led to where EU approaches to China have largely been uncontested and seen as essentially unproblematic. And there has been a shift, or there was a shift for a period, towards accommodation of China. But I think in the past year, thankfully after the cut-off date for my empirical analysis, things have actually started to change a little bit. I think if we look at the EU's responses to China since 2017, as Theresa said at the Belton Road Forum, and with the issue of needing to address a system for screening Chinese foreign direct investment into Europe and implications for critical national infrastructure, such as the ports, I do think we're perhaps seeing a shift among EU policymakers. But the EU does still lack a coherent geostrategic vision in general, despite the advances, the steps taken forward in the 2016 global strategy. And it lacks a coherent China strategy as well. I think these are significant problems. And to diverge from Sven's praise for the global strategy, I agree with many of the things he brought up. But from my reading of it, one of the most significant weaknesses is how little attention the document pays to the great powers of the international system, and particularly China. Now, at the same time, much overshadowed, the EU did actually publish a new paper called Elements for a New China Strategy. It wasn't a new China strategy, but it said it acknowledged that it needed one. Unfortunately for the European Union, this was largely drafted by UK officials and was not in coordination with the team drawing up the global strategy. So there are actually elements of disconnect between the two papers. And I think this is problematic for the European Union. I think the Elements for a New China Strategy document will largely be ignored because of who it was drafted by, and the fact that global strategy is certainly the focus of the EU now. So I think there's kind of a missed opportunity in that respect. So the challenge for the EU, as I see it, is to really come up with a way of thinking more coherently about China. And this coherence comes across both internally with respect to the EU in terms of getting the institutional actors and the member states on the same page, and as Theresa has highlighted, that's going to be very problematic in terms of states like Hungary and Greece having very divergent interests at the moment. And we often talk about China as having a divide and rule strategy with respect to the EU, but as one of my recent co-authors, Miguel Otero Iglesias, has argued and is very fond of saying at conferences a lot, is that China doesn't often need to divide the EU member states because they're already divided when it comes to China anyway, so there's very little work for China to do. It just has to keep encouraging these states along the path. But the EU does need a more coherent strategy towards China, and to the extent that it has tried to address these in documents like the Elements for a New China Strategy, it has failed to understand how the various manifestations of China's rise, which are coming into sharper focus, such as the Belton Road initiative, it's failed to understand how these are actually connected in China's strategy, not just to Europe, but to the wider world. And I'll kind of explain in a little while why I make these connections and why I think this is something that you need to consider. I'm sure some of you read James Palmer's recent piece for Foreign Policy that was entitled "Nobody Knows Anything About China," which is a very interesting article about how little how little we know about China relative to what we think we know about China, and how little we know about the decision-making processes within China. So, although I'm making this claim that these elements of China's rise are actually part of an interconnected strategy, I can't say that for sure because I don't know the inner workings of the Politburo, but I think it's fair to say that if we think about the Belton Road initiative as being the center of this strategy, now China's behavior in other aspects of its foreign policy are all directed to delivering this ambitious project, and the cause is so closely tied on a personal level with President Xi right now. But if you look at how China is pressing issues in the South China Sea, I don't think it's possible to ignore the fact that the maritime route of the Belton Road initiative passes through the South China Sea. So this is about the resources in the South China Sea, but it's also about changing the order of power within East Asia itself. Up until now, China has been a free rider on the US security provision within the region. That's allowed China to benefit significantly in economic terms and trade. But China seems to be less willing to accept that order now and is looking for ways to expand its own power. And being able to control the sea lanes of communication through the South China Sea would be essentially a priority for the actual realization of the Belton Road initiative longer term. The AIIB obviously is explicitly related to the Belton Road initiative, but that's unique for multilateral development banks, right? So this is a new kind of system that China's putting up. China has said that it's going to adhere to international norms of transparency and sustainability with respect to the AIIB and its initiatives, but it's not clear how it's actually going to be able to operationalize that. And then if we look at the 16+1 format as well, China's although countries like the US and Russia have historically tried to carve out favourable groups within the region, that's a new step for China, and it has been fairly successful up until now, I would argue, within that. And also then China's participation in the joint sea exercises with Russia, and power projection is a very sort of natural next step for a rising great power. But there is a genuine question of What's China's interest in the Mediterranean, Baltic seas in particular? What's the advantage of being able to exercise there? And it's about signaling the arrival of China as a global power as much as it is about those specific regions, right? So this also ties into having the naval base in Djibouti, which is, again, part of where the maritime route is going to pass through, and it gives China the ability to protect its economic interests. But again, it's signaling the arrival of China, as well as being able to expand its power more easily through the system. But I think if you look at how the EU has tried to respond to each of these issues, whether it's the South China Sea ruling, whether it's about then talking about next steps, France under President Hollande talked about perhaps an EU participation in the freedom of navigation operations alongside the US. Phone ops are a tactic, not a strategy. The US, I don't think, has a clear strategy within the South China Sea per se. I don't think the EU really knows what it wants to do apart from signal its intent to the US that it does intend to be a partner in the region within that. So I think so far, I'm just going to end because my time's almost up, that the EU hasn't really started to recognise that these issues are interrelated. And in order to be able to influence any one of these components successfully, it has to start thinking about how they're connected. And how when China tries to influence EU member states on any given issue, this is part of China's wider strategy to promote the Belton Road initiative and its own arrival as a great power in the international system. And until then, I don't think the EU will really be a meaningful player in shaping the rise of China into the national order. Thanks.